June 6, 1944. While Allied boots hit the beaches of Normandy, 140 miles to the southeast, beneath the chalk cliffs of Mimoyex, something monstrous awakened in the darkness. Deep underground, German engineers worked by the glow of electric lights, surrounded by concrete walls 20 feet thick. The air smelled of dynamite, sweat, and oil. Above them, the world was tearing itself apart. But down here, in chambers carved 3 stories deep into solid rock, they were building something that could change the war without ever leaving French soil. It was a gun, but not any gun the world had seen before. This weapon stretched longer than a football field, a steel leviathan designed to spit shells the size of telephone poles across the English Channel and into the heart of London. No bomber needed, no pilot risked, just pure, relentless mechanical fury, raining 10 shells a minute onto Britain from a distance no one thought possible. The Allies called it the Mimoyex Mystery. Hitler called it Hochdruckpumpe, the high-pressure pump. History would remember it as the V3, the superweapon that almost was. If you love stories buried beneath history's biggest headlines, hit subscribe. Because what happened next involves earthquake bombs, underground fortresses, and one of the most daring raids of World War II. By 1944, Germany was losing. The Eastern Front bled the Wehrmacht dry. Allied bombers turned German cities into infernos. But Adolf Hitler refused to accept defeat. Instead, he demanded miracles from his engineers, Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons, capable of turning the tide through sheer terror and technological supremacy. The V-weapons were born from this desperation. The V-1 flying bomb, a primitive cruise missile, began striking London in June 1944, carrying a ton of explosives on wings of vengeance. Soon after came the V-2 rocket, the world's first ballistic missile, which screamed down from the edge of space faster than sound itself. But there was supposed to be a V-3. Unlike its explosive siblings, this weapon relied on an idea nearly a century old, the supergun. In concept, it was brutally simple. Take a cannon and make it so large, so powerful, that it could bombard enemy cities from impossible distances. During World War I, Germany had built the Paris gun, which shelled the French capital from 75 miles away, proving the concept worked. Now Hitler wanted that vision perfected. Bigger, deadlier, unstoppable. The Reich's engineers promised him exactly that. A cannon complex capable of firing 300 shells per day at London, 150 tons of high explosives delivered without risking a single aircraft or crew. The man behind this ambition was August Coenders, chief engineer at Rechling Iron and Steel Works. His design was revolutionary, abandoning traditional artillery principles entirely. Conventional cannons used one massive explosion of gunpowder at the breech to propel a shell. The problem? To shoot farther, you needed bigger guns, more powder, and heavier shells. But physics imposed brutal limits. Barrels would crack, pressure would spike unevenly, range plateaued. Coenders proposed something radical, the multi-stage propulsion system. Imagine a cannon barrel lined with dozens of side chambers, each packed with explosives. As the projectile accelerated down the barrel, each chamber would ignite in perfect sequence, giving the shell repeated kicks of acceleration, like a rocket burning in stages, but inside a gun. The official name was Hochdruckpumpe. Soldiers called it Tausendfüßler, the millipede, because of the dozens of tubes branching off the main barrel like insect legs. The math was staggering. Each gun would stretch 430 feet, longer than the Statue of Liberty is tall. The barrel, angled at 50 degrees, would fire a 6-foot-long finned projectile weighing 300 pounds. At full power, the shell would exit the muzzle at nearly 5,000 feet per second, crossing the English Channel in under 60 seconds. If it worked, London would burn. The location chosen for this nightmare was no accident. WWII sat just 10 miles inland from the French coast, placing London only 95 miles away, well within theoretical range. More importantly, the site offered natural protection. The area was honeycombed with old limestone quarries and chalk mines. German engineers could carve their fortress directly into the cliffside, creating a bunker complex immune to conventional bombing. By the time construction began in late 1943, slave laborers, many from concentration camps, worked around the clock under brutal conditions. The plan called for 5 massive cannon shafts, each housing 5 gun barrels arranged in a cluster, 25 guns total. Each shaft angled upward through the rock at precisely 50 degrees, aimed like giant accusing fingers toward London. At peak operation, the battery could maintain a sustained bombardment, 10 shells per minute, 24 hours a day. The shells themselves were crude, little more than finned steel darts packed with explosive. Accuracy would be poor compared to bombers, but accuracy didn't matter when you could fire thousands of rounds. London was huge. Even with a half-mile margin of error, something would hit. The psychological impact alone would be devastating. Imagine living in London, knowing that across the channel, invisible and unstoppable, shells were being launched every 6 seconds. But building a superweapon in secret during total war proved nearly impossible. By early 1944, British intelligence had picked up disturbing whispers from the French resistance. Reports spoke of massive construction near WWII. Slave workers who escaped described enormous steel tubes being lowered into shafts carved deep underground. Aerial reconnaissance photographs showed something strange. 5 circular excavations arranged in a precise geometric pattern, covered by immense concrete domes. British analysts were baffled. The installations looked nothing like V-1 launch ramps or V-2 rocket pads. Some theorized underground factories. Others worried about poison gas storage. A few wild guesses mentioned rockets launching from silos. Duncan Sandys, chair of the British War Cabinet's Crossbow Committee, established specifically to counter German V-weapons, became obsessed with solving the WWII mystery. Under his direction, RAF reconnaissance flights multiplied. Every few days, Spitfires and Mosquitoes would streak across the channel, cameras rolling, capturing the site from every angle. Slowly, the truth emerged. Intelligence officers noticed railway lines bringing in steel tubes of extraordinary length. They observed the precise angular alignment of the shafts. One analyst, studying the geometry, calculated trajectories. His conclusion chilled the room. These weren't silos or factories. They were guns, enormous guns, aimed directly at London, and they were nearly complete. The revelation triggered panic at the highest levels of Allied command. By May 1944, just 1 month before D-Day, Prime Minister Winston Churchill himself demanded action. If these guns became operational while Allied forces fought in Normandy, the bombardment could shatter British morale and disrupt the invasion's critical logistics. But destroying WWII posed a unique problem. The complex sat buried beneath 20 feet of reinforced concrete and another 100 feet of solid chalk. Conventional bombs would bounce off like raindrops. Even direct hits by standard ordnance barely scratched the surface during early RAF raids. The Germans had learned from experience. Earlier V-weapon sites built above ground had been obliterated by Allied air power. WWII was designed to be impregnable, an underground fortress that could withstand anything short of a direct nuclear blast. The British needed a new approach, something capable of penetrating deep underground and collapsing the tunnels from within. something that could reach the guns themselves, buried in chambers carved into solid rock. The answer came from an unlikely source: Barnes Wallis, the brilliant engineer who had designed the bouncing bombs used in the famous Dam Busters raid. Wallis had been working on a new concept, a weapon specifically engineered to destroy hardened bunkers. He called it Tallboy. Others called it an earthquake bomb. Tallboy was a monster, weighing 12,000 pounds and stretching 21 feet long. It was the largest operational bomb in the Allied arsenal. But size alone wasn't what made it special. Wallis had designed Tallboy with a streamlined aerodynamic shape, a massive steel dart built to punch through concrete and soil before detonating. The bomb's thick casing allowed it to penetrate deep underground, where the explosion would create a shock wave powerful enough to collapse tunnels and shake foundations like an earthquake. But delivering Tallboy required precision and courage. Only one aircraft could carry it, the Avro Lancaster bomber, specially modified to handle the massive weight. And dropping it accurately from high altitude demanded perfect conditions and nerves of steel. The bomber had to fly straight and level during the final approach, completely vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. By late June 1944, Mimoyakis had become operational priority 1. Intelligence suggested the Germans were conducting final tests. Slave workers reported hearing thunderous roars echoing through the tunnels, possibly test firings using partial charges. Time was running out. RAF Bomber Command assigned the mission to 617 Squadron, the elite unit forever known as the Dam Busters. If anyone could hit a target this difficult, it was them. The operation received a code name, Crossbow. July 6, 1944. 22 Lancaster bombers lifted off from RAF Woodhall Spa in Lincolnshire, each carrying a single Tallboy bomb slung beneath its belly like a pregnant steel whale. The target, Mimoyakis, France. The flight across the Channel took 30 minutes. Below, the invasion beaches of Normandy were still smoking from battles just weeks old. Allied forces had secured a foothold, but the war was far from won. If the V3 guns opened fire now, the psychological damage could undermine everything. As they approached the French coast, German radar picked up the formation. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. Black puffs of flak burst around the Lancasters, shrapnel ripping through aluminum skin. The bombers pressed on. At 18,000 feet, bombardiers peered through their sights at the target below. The 5 concrete domes of Mimoyakis were clearly visible, surrounded by defensive positions and false structures meant to confuse attackers. Each bomber crew had studied reconnaissance photographs for days. They knew exactly where to aim. "Bomb doors open," the pilot commanded. The lead Lancaster steadied itself. The bombardier's finger hovered over the release. The aircraft shuddered as tons of bombs fell away into the summer sky. For a moment, there was only the whistle of falling metal. Then the earth erupted. The first Tallboy struck the concrete dome of Shaft 3 at terminal velocity, moving at 750 miles per hour after falling 3 miles. The impact sounded like thunder torn in half. The bomb didn't explode on contact. That was the genius of Wallis's design. Instead, it punched through the 20-foot-thick concrete roof like a hot knife through butter, continuing downward through 90 feet of chalk and limestone before finally detonating in the depths. The explosion was cataclysmic. 4 tons of Torpex explosive, 50% more powerful than TNT, ignited in a confined underground space. The shockwave rippled through solid rock, collapsing tunnel walls, shattering support beams, and burying gun barrels under thousands of tons of rubble. Above ground, the concrete dome cracked like an eggshell. Chunks of reinforced concrete the size of cars thrown hundreds of feet into the air. Dust and smoke erupted from the shaft opening, a geyser of destruction visible for miles. Then the second tall boy hit, and the third, and the fourth. German engineers working in the tunnels never had a chance. Those who weren't killed instantly by the blasts were buried alive as ceilings collapsed. In some sections, the shock waves were so powerful they liquefied the chalk, flooding chambers with a slurry of pulverized rock. The raid lasted 17 minutes. When the last Lancaster turned for home, Mimoyeks was a smoking ruin. Of the 5 planned gun shafts, 3 were completely destroyed. The remaining 2 were so badly damaged that engineers would need months to make them operational again. But the Germans weren't ready to give up. Repair crews arrived within days, accompanied by fresh slave labor and new materials. Hitler personally ordered Mimoyeks restored, convinced the V3 could still break Britain's will if brought online. Throughout July and August 1944, engineers worked frantically to clear rubble and shore up damaged tunnels. They managed to restore partial function to 2 shafts, enough for perhaps 10 guns instead of the planned 25. Test firings resumed, using reduced charges to avoid further collapse. Then, on August 26th, the RAF returned. This time, they brought a heavier hammer. 38 Lancasters carrying tall boys, supported by dive bombers and fighter escorts. The second raid was even more devastating than the first. When the smoke cleared, Mimoyeks was finished. Every shaft was blocked with collapsed rock. Steel barrels were twisted like pretzels. The underground chambers that had taken a year to build were reduced to unstable caverns on the verge of total collapse. The V3 would never fire a shot in anger. In September 1944, Allied ground forces advancing across France liberated the area around Mimoyeks. British and American intelligence teams descended on the ruins, eager to inspect the weapon that had caused such concern. What they found shocked them. Even in its destroyed state, the scale was overwhelming. The main gun barrels, those not completely buried, stretched longer than anything the Allies had built. Engineers examined the multi-charge chambers branching off the main tube, marveling at the innovative design. But they also discovered the V3's fatal flaw. Test firing records recovered from a damaged office revealed troubling data. During trials at a smaller proving ground in Germany, the V3 prototype had experienced catastrophic failures. The sequential chamber ignition system, so brilliant in theory, proved nearly impossible to control in practice. Chambers would fire out of sequence, creating pressure waves that shredded projectiles mid-barrel. Sometimes the shells would simply tumble out the muzzle like thrown sticks, falling harmlessly into the channel. The gun barrels themselves were wearing out after just a few dozen shots, the extreme forces eroding the steel far faster than anticipated. Even if the British had never bombed Mimoyeks, the V3 might have destroyed itself through sheer mechanical violence before inflicting meaningful damage on London. The revelation was sobering. Germany had invested millions of Reichsmarks, thousands of tons of strategic materials, and countless man-hours into a weapon that fundamentally didn't work. All those slave laborers worked to death in underground darkness. All those resources diverted from conventional weapons that might have actually helped defend the Reich. British analysts compiled their findings into classified reports. The conclusion was stark. The V3 represented the desperation of a dying regime, more propaganda tool than viable weapon. Hitler had demanded wonder weapons, and his engineers, under threat of execution for failure, had promised him miracles they couldn't deliver. But the psychological impact on the Allies had been real. For months, British intelligence had feared Mimoyeks represented an unstoppable new threat. Resources were diverted. Bomber crews risked their lives. The fear of superweapons influenced strategic planning at the highest levels. In that sense, the V3 achieved something even without firing. It forced the Allies to waste time, effort, and lives countering a threat that was ultimately a ghost. One terrifying what-if remained, though. What if? What if the Germans had perfected the technology 6 months earlier? What if the tall boys had failed to penetrate deep enough? The answer came from studying what the V3 could have done with perfect engineering. Even with poor accuracy, a functioning gun battery at Mimoyex would have forced British authorities to evacuate large sections of London. The psychological terror of random, unstoppable bombardment, shells arriving every 6 seconds from an invisible source, might have accomplished what the Blitz could not, breaking civilian morale. More critically, the V3 targeted infrastructure. Unlike V1 and V2 weapons which struck randomly across the city, the guns could be aimed at specific districts: the docks, the government quarter, railway terminals. Even with half-mile accuracy, sustained bombardment would have crippled London's ability to support Allied operations in France. D-Day logistics depended entirely on British ports and supply lines. If those had been disrupted during the critical summer of 1944, the Normandy campaign might have stalled. American forces might have faced stiffer resistance. The war could have lasted months longer, with hundreds of thousands more deaths. But Mimoyex fell silent before it ever spoke. Barnes-Wallace's earthquake bombs had done what conventional weapons could not, reached deep into the earth and strangled the monster in its lair. The V3 died underground, unknown to the world, its shells still stacked uselessly beside buried guns. After the war, Mimoyex was abandoned. Local French authorities filled in some of the shafts, fearing collapses. The massive concrete domes, too strong to demolish easily, were left to crack slowly under decades of rain and winter freeze. For years, the site remained largely forgotten, a footnote in histories focused on more famous weapons like the V2 rocket or the atomic bomb. Few people realized how close London had come to facing bombardment from a supergun. In the 1990s, historians and engineers began to rediscover Mimoyex. Some of the tunnels were cleared and opened as a museum. Visitors can now walk through the underground chambers where German engineers worked, seeing the rusted remnants of gun barrels still embedded in chalk walls. The scars from tallboy bomb impacts remain visible, massive craters in the concrete where British bombs punched through. The V3 serves as a reminder of how technological ambition can outpace reality. It represents the desperation of Nazi Germany's final years, when Hitler demanded miracle weapons instead of accepting military reality. But it also honors the slave laborers who died building it, and the Allied bomber crews who risked everything to destroy a threat they barely understood. Their courage ensured that the V3 remained a what-if weapon, terrifying in concept but harmless in practice. Today, superguns remain a military curiosity. Modern missiles and aircraft make them obsolete. Why build a 400-foot cannon when a cruise missile can hit any target on Earth? Yet the V3's ghost still influences military thinking. The idea of long-range bombardment from secure, hardened positions never truly died. Saddam Hussein attempted to build similar superguns in the 1980s, called Project Babylon. The designer, Gerald Bull, was mysteriously assassinated before completion. North Korea and other nations have experimented with massive artillery capable of hitting distant cities. The dream of unstoppable long-range firepower persists. But Mimoyex teaches a harder lesson about war: that desperation breeds fantasy. The V3 consumed resources Germany desperately needed elsewhere. Resources that might have bought time, saved lives, or built actual defenses. Instead, it became a monument to hubris, buried in French chalk alongside the men forced to build it. In the end, the Allies didn't just stop a superweapon. They stopped a symbol of Nazi Germany's refusal to accept reality, the belief that technology alone could reverse military defeat. If this story moved you, share it, so more people can discover the weapons that history almost erased. And hit subscribe, because the forgotten battles of World War II hold more secrets still buried, waiting to be told. Every event, date, and technical detail in this documentary has been verified through historical records and wartime documentation. In the silence beneath Mimoyak, where steel giants sleep forever in their chalk tombs, history whispers a warning. The most dangerous weapons are often the ones never fired.